Okay, should I start? All right. So welcome everyone to this session of the seminar on social movements and political action that is based in Lisbon. Today we have a roundtable on contested solidarities with Pierre, Monfort, Didem, Türkoğlu, I hope I'm not butchering your name, and Nino, Zhgenti, who will speak about these issues in their own research. This is a roundtable done in association with the with CIES, the Council of European Studies, and the Network on Social Movements that both I and Louisa co-chair, but also in association with the networks on social movements from and political participation from the ECPR and ESA. And this basically is a seminar that wants to introduce and kick off the discussion of a conference that is being organized in Vienna exactly on this topic, and that we are currently organizing the free associations. It has been a great joy to work all together on this. So I'll just briefly present the seminar and the speakers. So for those who don't know, the seminar, to get a brief sense of what we normally do every month, as well as the speakers, and then they will present their thoughts on the topic. Let's just share the page of the seminar. So I think you can all see, right? So basically the seminar was created by Guya Cornero and Britta Baumgarten in 2014, and it's now 10 years. We actually celebrated the 10 years with one day in October, a full day of presentations on housing and on the housing and housing movement, mainly in Lisbon. And so the seminar, since the pandemic, has been online, but not only online, but also hybrid. And you can check in all of them. We have the recordings of the session. So if you want to go back and see the work that's being done by in this research, you can always go back. As you can see, last year we had a similar event to that we have here today on contemporary challenge social movement studies as a kickoff discussion to the pre-conference event that the social movement networks of the Council of European Studies organized in Lyon last year. So the seminar, as you can see, has covers various topics, from democratic innovations to social movements, to political participation, to environmental movements, also radical left and national identity that we had a book discussion last year. And it tries to cover not only topics in Europe and the Western world, but also in places like in the global South, like Mozambique and other places. The last session in February was about Turkey, and the next few ones will have Andrea Pirro and Pietro Castelli presenting their new book on the movement parties of the far right, and we will also have Anabela Dias-Felix presenting on her research on community-oriented policing in Brazil and Mexico. So this just to give you a quick idea of what the seminar does, and we will keep doing this. We're now organizing and preparing the sessions for June and July, and feel free also to propose sessions for next year if you want to present, and visit us in Lisbon as well. And my cat decided to come around. So So maybe we can go to the presenters, and so we have three presenters today, as I said. We have Pierre Monfort, who is just recently moved to the University of Barcelona, if I'm not wrong. And Pierre has a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, was a postdoc in Montreal, and he is teaching now in Barcelona. Is a political sociology with a particular focus on social movements, and he has a book from 2014 called Europeanizing Contention: The Protest Against Fortress Europe in France and Germany. And more recently, he's been examining the role of volunteers, and he's also doing research on the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum adopted in 2024. Didem is a political sociologist as well, and she's currently an assistant professor at the core program Kadir University Istanbul in Turkey. She completed her PhD from North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she focuses on political sociology, social movement, media, and the studies of social inequalities. And she has published in Southern European Society and Politics, Mobilization, Current Sociology, Social Media and Society, Social Compass, and Journal of Democracy. Last but not least, Nino Zhgenti. She's an associate professor at the Free University of Tbilisi, and she has a PhD from the University of Milan, Italy, on social protests in Georgia, and she also graduated from Oxford. So so that's it. I think I'll leave the floor to the speakers and for Luisa as well to moderate the session. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. So we've been already thinking an order of presenters. We started with Nino. Sounds good?
Yes,
Okay.
I will share presentation.
Thank you.
Also, how can share this?
So from share, there is a button, green one on the bottom, and then when you click, you should select sharing your screen. Or your presentation directly, you can share.
Yes, maybe I can send you. I don't know why I have this problem. So should I send?
Yeah, sorry, we didn't define before who was clicking in, so no problem. Yeah. Or if Didem want to start, we can, in the meanwhile, I can download Nino's presentation, and so maybe we can.
Sure, no problem on my part. Should I go ahead?
Oh yeah, so no stress for you, Nino. You can send me by email your presentation, and then after that, yeah, no problem.
Yeah, technology is always stressful, right?
Yeah.
So I understand.
Absolutely.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Well, no problem. So I'm taking the mic. Since it's kind of a roundtable, I decided not to present in a kind of informal manner with PowerPoints, etc. But I wanted to, talk to you directly as if you are in the same room and, you know, just exchange ideas. And the starting point I want to have in terms of our discussion is not necessarily a definition of solidarity, but starting from one end of how solidarities work in the kind of same area of movements towards how it's kind of changed, changing times and political structures today. So my starting point is going to be talking about the type of movements that we are all familiar with, and that's going to be the student movements, because we are on campuses and always interacting with the students, and student protests and mobilization have made a lot of impact in different countries around the world. So for me, I think one of the important points that we need to perhaps consider in terms of what are the challenges to solidarity building is going to be related to perceptions of experiences, because I know that my colleagues are going to talk from different angles of solidarity building, but one of the kind of important, let's say, glues that put people together in terms of showing solidarity is not necessarily limited to empathy, but also shaped by perceived shared experiences or shared identities. And when it comes to student protests, it's kind of a given that student protests are usually shaped by activists who would like to emphasize a certain perceived identity and urgency that the students as a group, as a social group, should react based on their identities. And we have seen this kind of solidarity-based movements within students on campuses that highlight student identity since the 60s, but even before, even at the time of 1910s, even like when students have started to organize on campuses through clubs or associations, we see the emphasis on identity-based solidarities with different groups or different kind of causes that interest the students over time. If you look at how these shared experiences or shared visions have been tools for call for action throughout history, not only in Western Europe, but other parts of the world, we can see two main things. One is going to be changing material conditions that affect students or large bodies of students as a whole. That might be related to, like, say, mobilization against economic conditions, against introduction of tuition fees on campuses, or it could be related to material conditions in their own kind of national, local settings that specifically affect students in a specific way. And that specific way is usually, you know, young adults ready to enter real life and being insecure in their kind of visions for the possibility of a future. We have seen this type of action, not only on the left, but also on the right, based on certain perceived kind of needs for showing solidarity with different movements. For example, we have seen left-wing movements on campuses trying to build kind of solidarity with class-based movements, labor movements, or it could be related to the women's movement, it could be related to the environmental movement, or it could be something related to an ongoing mobilization on the other side of the world. So, for example, in the case of South Africa and anti-apartheid movement, we have seen a chain of events that organized students from all over the world, Western Europe, Netherlands, United States, Canada, Great Britain, all over the place. And they use their identities as students, as the future generations, or as students who are directly involved in the socioeconomic conditions of their own universities, building up these kind of movements with an idea towards showing solidarity with ongoing movements elsewhere, but highlighting their identities as students. Like, we will remember cases, for example, in Great Britain, where students will use their identities as being moral witness to injustice that's going on in the case of apartheid-led South Africa, as a critique towards government policies. You will see these movements building shanty towns in elite campuses across the United States, and using their kind of identities as, we are the youth, we are the educated, we are here to show moral witness to the ongoing injustices. These were very kind of, how should I put it, impactful in the way they were able to bring in media attention to their causes by using their relatively privileged position in society. A second one that's going to be a bit more close to home, perhaps, is the recent kind of tuition hikes and recent neoliberal kind of reforms in higher education that we have seen since the year 2000. As you know, with the steps toward enlargement of higher education comes the question of who is going to pay for these new universities or greater number of students. And one of the common solutions that the government came up with is let's increase tuitions or let's introduce tuitions if they don't exist. And my research is going to be was based on that. And I found out that in almost all of the OECD countries, like rich democracies, governments have tried to impose or increase tuition fees. And yet, in half of them, student mobilization was able to stop them. That was kind of unexpected because this was the time period when student protests were very much at the background. But one of the things that they were able to do is to utilize shared experiences or perceived shared experiences for a future with material problems to mobilize against tuition fee hikes. And one of the relatively successful in quotations cases was in Germany, where in half of the states, the governments introduced tuition fees, but as a result of mobilization and also alliances with the movements like labor, students were over time were able to overturn these decisions by, of course, playing into electoral politics and making it costly for right-wing governments to have tuitions. But similarly, in the case of Turkey, we have seen a successful mobilization against the government that proposed tuition hikes as a result of an alliance that they built with labor, who was basically providing know-how to challenge these tuition fees, even as kind of close to our date as 2011, right? But at the same time, these experiences or perceptions of experiences of solidarity with other movements like labor movements, environmental movements, or anti-apartheid movements have this idea that there is something called a shared student identity. But today, as consumerism is taking deeper roots on campuses, I'm getting a little bit cynical or skeptical about how successful these student identity-based movements could be in the future, because over time we see a growing discourse of consumerism or individualist kind of justifications for collective action, even for cases of showing solidarity. Like some of the mobilizations on campuses today are trying to build solidarity bases, but at the same time they are facing this, let's say, discourse or frame that labels students not as a collective, as a social group, but as an individual who is basically receiving services. And that's going to be a problem, especially in terms of building solidarities or building alliances across class or race-based identities, if they become much more primary than a shared experience. So as a result of this, the tone of student identity might change if this type of kind of cultural tone becomes a challenge for the student groups. It might become more fragile, or it might need building more alliances with different groups, or using intermediary organizations or intermediary groups to build kind of different rhetorics around identity-based solidarities, perhaps on student movements or on campuses. There's an ongoing protest, as I'm sure you're aware, in Serbia, university played a role. I haven't studied this, but I'm curious to see how they are going to utilize these kind of identities or shaped perceptions of a given future in terms of their own organizing. I think this is where I will stop by throwing away a kind of a question or a case that is going on in our contemporary kind of vision or the news, and pass the mic to my colleagues, and we will come back to these issues, I'm sure, after their own remarks.
Okay, Didem, thank you very much. So yeah, Didem basically introduced this student identity-based solidarity, the use of shared experiences and vision. the fragility of student solidarities and the role of intermediary organizations that we can dig more after all the presentations, just to start collecting some topics. And now if Nino is ready, we could I can share her presentation. Nino, or you prefer us to... Oh, we lost her. Maybe we go ahead with Pierre then. Sorry, I can't. There's some technical issues today. Pierre, would you like to introduce your next topic?
I think she's here.
Nino's there. Okay. Okay, perfect. Are you okay for presenting?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sharing your presentation then. Okay.
Thank you, Luisa. Today I want to very briefly share with you some of my preliminary insights from my ongoing project on the affective polarization of social protests. And one of the cases I'm exploring in this project is the case of current Georgian protests, which began last year in November after the ruling pro-Russian Georgian Dreams Party suspended EU accession until 2028. So I'm particularly interested in the role of emotions, how they interact, why they lead to action, and how despair, which might typically lead to disengagement, fuels continued protests. So as I already mentioned, the protest started on November 28, 2024, after Georgian Dream delayed EU accession, adding to tensions over the disputed October elections, which was in the same year. So opposition parties, the president, civil society rejected the election results as fraudulent, and what initially started as a reaction to foreign policy shift quickly evolved into a nationwide movement demanding new elections. So today is the 106th day of protest. So from the first weeks in November, protesters faced beatings and detentions. Business and common people has been targeted, pressured, and arrested for their political views, creating an atmosphere of fear, terror, and insecurity. So yet, rather than discouraging mobilization, state repression, especially in December, intensified the protests, strengthening solidarity in response to the growing number of victims of state violence. So as someone directly involved in this protest, I began engaging in informal conversations with participants, and I encountered a wide spectrum of emotions. Some protesters expressed hope and determination, while others were deeply skeptical about the possibility of the meaningful change. So what struck me most, however, was the overwhelming sense of despair in some of the participants and victims and activists as well. And here I will only focus on those respondents who experienced and expressed despair in collective action as a catalyst for change. So these protesters voiced their belief that nothing would change and the government showed no signs of concessions, and that they were confident that their demands would not be met. Yet despite this despair, the same protesters kept showing up. So this contradiction became a starting point for my ethnographic exploration. And the major questions that I had in mind was, what does this state of despair reveal? How does protest persist when there is widespread disillusionment? And what does it mean for sustainability of the movement when people continue to act despite the overwhelming sense of despair? So the answer to all these questions revealed later on to be solidarity. And one of the participants, during my fieldwork, which always I remember this words, was saying that we don't know what else to do, but we must be here for those who are repressed. So this phrase became a reoccurring theme in these interviews. So they in interviews that I made, among participants of the protest, activists, and they did not have any hope in systematic transformation, but they had a deep sense of obligation to others, not to the cause itself, but to others. So for some participants and activists, this was a shift from protest as a goal-driven, changing policies, gaining rights, to protest as an act of witnessing and resistance, where act of showing up becomes meaningful in itself, regardless of expected political outcomes. So rather than a single driving emotion, their participation was shaped by interwoven emotions. And here I just give you 3 examples of emotional pairings that revealed the diverse affective and moral pathways sustaining solidarity. So one of them is protective solidarity. This is how I labeled it, where respondents were talking about fear and empathy at the same time. So they showed up not because they were fearless, but because their fear was outweighed by their concern for others. And as they said, it was a kind of moral duty to stand by the victims, even in fear. The second one is defined solidarity, as I named it, so where respondents were talking simultaneously about moral outrage and pride. So they persisted despite knowing they might not win, simply because resistance itself became a source of dignity, and a moral outrage was a sense of anger-driven resistance, while pride was deeply tied to collective identity. And the third one is reciprocal solidarity, where mostly this gratitude and love emerged in their talking. So particularly among those who felt, and it was particularly among those who felt personally supported by the movement. And gratitude was expressed toward fellow protesters who had sacrificed more, those who had been detained and injured. And love was described as a deep emotional attachment to the collective, to the friendships, shared struggle, and the feeling of belonging in the movement. And all these sentiments were very much obvious in the visuals of protests, like posters or any other informal discussions with these kind of protesters who at the same time felt this despair. So there were many more cases where respondents' experiences could be read in different emotional trajectories. And protest participants have many commonalities, but they also have differences in a sense that they experience different emotional pathways to solidarity protests. And what fuels one person's action is different from another's. So, and it is very much determined by their social and political background. So just to wrap up, I want to say that in the presence of despair, which always is very puzzling for me, like solidarity functions as a buffer against emotional exhaustion. So protesters who felt connected through reciprocal emotions such as empathy, gratitude, anger, and love were more likely to persist even when they saw no political progress. So this, I believe, resonates with social movement scholarship and the many solidarity protests that have emerged across borders nowadays, from global solidarity movements for Ukraine war or Gaza victims to migrant solidarity initiatives, climate justice movements or workers' rights, and many, many more. So these struggles show that emotional connection is transnational, and social movements do not survive merely by keeping hope alive, but by fostering emotional resilience through solidarity despite resistance. So what matters in this case, as I see it, is the ability to create an emotional infrastructure that sustains engagement despite despair and counteractions. So protest, in this case, protest is not only about changing laws and policies. It is about affirming human connection, moral agency, and collective dignity, even in the face of an uncertain future. And perhaps in the end, change becomes inevitable. But But this emotional resonance is always so vivid, like across borders. When it's like in Georgia, we also had this solidarity protests to Ukraine, for example, and there were massive protests in regard to this. And even now, in this protest, you will see a flag of Ukraine. And yeah, this is just very briefly what I wanted to say. And also, I just wanted to add that this is what this like emotional aspect of this, I believe, is one of the reasons why the upcoming conferences in Vienna is both very timely and essential. And as a part of organizing team, I'm excited that we have received a diverse and very insightful body of work. And these contributions will not only deepen our understanding of contested solidarity within and amongst specific movements and protests, but also provide an opportunity to examine the rapidly unfolding injustices and cruelty, both locally and globally today. So on this note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Perfect. Yes, I totally agree. We received very good and interesting abstract. Thank you for everybody that submitted. And so the second presentation, we have been introducing topics on emotional aspects of solidarity and protest, and this emotional infrastructure in solidarity as means of survival. So also wrapping up for next discussion. And now we have Pierre with the last presentation, or as he said, some points he wanted to discuss. So please, the floor is yours. You're not seeing anymore the presentation, right? No. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Luisa. Thanks, Thiago. Thanks, everyone, for organizing this roundtable. So I will make a few points. And sorry if it's not really well organized. These are just a reflection I'm having at the moment. I'll make 3 points. First of all, the first one is about the ambivalence of solidarity. The second one is about shifting boundaries between different types of engagements that relate to solidarity. And I'm thinking in particular about protest and charity forms of engagement. So shifting boundaries between these different types of engagement. And I will conclude, I guess, with a broader point about politicization processes when we look at solidarity engagements. Okay, so these reflections are based on the new book that I finished to write, which is currently under review. And this relates also more generally to 2 research projects on which I've been working in the last 7 or 8 years. One is about solidarity with poor people, and I was working in particular in food banks in the UK. This was a smaller project. The other project was a more broader project on solidarity movements with regards to refugees and migrants, both in the UK and in France in the last 10 years or so. Okay, so the first point is about the ambivalence of solidarity movements. And here I will come back to some points that Nino made about the role of emotions. Solidarity movements usually are defined, and I'm thinking about the work by Donatella Della Porta, are defined as, solidarity is usually defined as a claim. It's defined also as an organizational practice and a form of a shared identity. But also crucially, solidarity is related to a set of emotions, and it's also, I would say, what we could define as a moral collective project. It's a project for the future. This focus, I think, especially on the emotional and moral aspect of solidarity, leads us to, I think, to underline the ambivalence of solidarity movements. If we look at emotions in particular, moral emotions, Jasper talks about moral emotions. solidarity, of course, is based on anger, outrage, but also on moral emotions such as compassion, empathy, and maybe also feelings of proximity towards those who are in need of solidarity. What I have shown in my research is that these specific set of emotions are highly ambivalent, highly ambiguous. In many cases, in the field work that we've done, they can be related to prescriptive disciplinary processes on how those who are in need of solidarity, in need of compassion, in need of support should behave, how they should be deserving of support. And so here we come to the figure of the deserving refugee, the deserving poor. Popendiek in an old book in the 1990s talked about the deserving poor. And also, if we think along these lines, I think solidarity often relates also to processes of exclusion, exclusion that relates to emotions such as compassion or empathy. There are representation of vulnerability. Those who are in need of support, those who are seen as vulnerable, as deserving poor or deserving refugees will be included, while those who are seen as undeserving refugees, undeserving poor will be excluded from solidarity practices. This is really something that struck me during my fieldwork when we talk to people who are engaged in solidarity movements, solidarity actions. And so these boundaries and these ambivalences are really much present in all the interviews that I've done and in all the observations that I've done. So this was, I guess, the first point. If we look at emotions in particular, this leads us to highlight a little bit the ambivalences of solidarity engagements. The second point is about the shifting boundaries between different forms of engagement, and I think solidarity as a framework is a good, interesting way of looking at it. People who are involved in very much what we would call depoliticized charity type of or humanitarian type of work would relate and would use the framework of solidarity to define, to present their work, to frame their work, but those also who are involved in more protesting, more politicized forms of action would use the framework, the frame of solidarity to present their work. What is, I think, is interesting is that the boundaries between these forms of engagement tends to shift. It shifts, and Donatella Della Porta again has shown that really well. It tends to shift in times of crisis. During the refugee crisis, those organizations that were more based on charity type of work tended to become more politicized and engaged into protest. And so this was also the case during the austerity crisis. And so in times of crisis, these boundaries shift. But also what I have shown in my research is that there are shifts that relate more specifically to the practice of solidarity and also to the practice of compassion. When volunteers or activists are engaged in the daily practice of solidarity and also compassion, they encounter a set of dilemmas, a set of difficulties that will make them, that will highlight the limitations, but also what I talked about earlier, the ambivalences of their engagements. And this leads them to have a reflection about what they do and the practice of solidarity in which they engage. And this leads them to shift the engagement in particular, and to maybe in some, well, not maybe, but in many cases to create new forms of alliances. And so what emerges through the practice of solidarity is the need to go beyond established interactions between those who show solidarity and those who are presented, defined as in need of solidarity. The need to go beyond top-down practices, and what this leads to is the emergence of more emancipatory practices at the end of the process. And I guess just to conclude on that, sorry, I was a bit long, I guess. Just to conclude on that, I think these points relate maybe to a broader point about politicization processes. I think this is what a reflection about solidarity can show us. Solidarity can be a form of very politicized type of engagement. It's about addressing systemic issues. But solidarity can be also depoliticizing when it relates strictly to practices of compassion and charity type of engagements. What I'm showing my research is that politicization occurs through the practice of solidarity, and it's a non-linear type of process. When we look at the literature, I'm thinking of maybe the work by Nina Ilyasov, politicization processes tend to be presented as a form of linear process. There is a sort of progress from individual-based type of framework to more systemic, society-based understandings of the issues we are dealing with. Well, what I'm showing is that there is something maybe more less linear than that. The processes that we show are not based on a sort of enlightenment about the issues that we are dealing with. They are based, I think, on the set of difficulties that people encounter in the daily practice of solidarity. What emerges in these difficulties, in the really, I talk about dilemmas a lot. The dilemmas that they face, they encounter in their daily practice of solidarity. What emerges from that is a diagnostic about the limitations of solidarity as a form of practice, a diagnostic about the limitations of emotions such as compassion in particular. And so I will leave it here on this more general point about politicization.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre. I think it's the three presentations were very complementary and bringing a lot of topics that we can discuss. So this last part, more general discussion on depoliticization and depoliticization of the solidarity movements. I think it's very crucial and interesting to understand with all the discussion over the set of moral and values and emotions and how they cross behavior and choices and selection of typology of top-down or bottom-up strategies of solidarity. So I leave the floor to anybody wants to contribute with some questions. Hope there is some person wants to break the ice and anybody, just let me check on there is anybody with since you're many, if anybody wants to ask a question, you can also just turn off your microphone and speak, because eventually I'm not seeing any hands. Yeah, Elena. Okay. Thank you, Elena. Please.
Yeah, I can break the ice. Thank you, everyone, for these wonderful presentations. And I have more curiosity for that I would like to address to all of you, and then one specific, more specific question for Nino. So my question for you is, what do you think, or what are your thoughts with respect to the reverse? Like, how is solidarity expressed by movements received by those who are addressed as the subjects of their solidarity. And and the other thing that concerns me is, what is your thoughts about how solidarities within movements that seem to be rather successful, so that kind of not percolate in society, because unfortunately it doesn't happen that often, but I don't know, those solidarities that seem to be attached to movement that are more successful can be co-opted, let's say, by movement adversaries or opponents. I'm thinking, for example, in particular to the sort of co-optation of the solidarities expressed by the youth environmental movements that were taking up and, you know, kind of theft, robbed by industrial companies that were expressing solidarities for their workers in Colombia for the coffee and whatever. So that these are my two very broad concerns. And then for Nino, I had a question on, I very much like this idea of the emotional infrastructure for solidarity and the three, and where I do see networks, you know, that I flip, as though I'm always very happy. I was wondering if you can give us any hint about whether all of these types of, if all these pieces of the infrastructure are strong, are equally strong, meaning, are these three branches of solidarity equally present within the mobilization? Do they appear or disappear at different times? Do they have the same rhythm? And could you observe any path dependency between previous type of mobilization that people might have engaged in and their tendency to express or to lean on one rather than another? Okay, I made like 1,000 questions, so thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Nino, would you like to reply now?
Thank you, Elena. I'll start with a question on Georgia, then on my. The thing is that this data is so rich. I mean, it's a qualitative data, and there's ethnography, and so I just presented a part of it, a small part of that, and those peers that I revealed, those are narrated in a way that those respondents was saying that those are important for them. So, for example, pride, like, yes, that was something that they were very proud of. But it doesn't mean that other emotions like anger, for example, doesn't exist. So I think I'm still thinking how to show this kind of network where, for example, some of the emotions are always there, for example, anger, but the difference is in kind of intensity. So, for example, someone who is more about gratitude and love, they are very passive in their anger, kind of expressing anger verbally. So they more lean to this kind of emotional kind of support within them. These emotion peers show kind of those peers who are in front, but they all have the base emotions which have kind of context for them. My next step will be to show how this kind of develops and in their narratives and in their talks, how they talk about this. So this is one thing that I feel, but then to motivate me and to do something, something happened, and then I got like very, I don't know, outrage, or I got very, I felt empathy. So do you know, do you understand what I mean? So there, like, it's a very kind of complex interaction, but this emotion pairs are kind of very useful in a sense to see what in that moment are the most felt and important for them. And it doesn't mean that they don't have, for example, all three sample of respondents, like if I can say so, they didn't feel anger, for example. Of course, they all felt, but it was the matter of intensity. And also all this is very much contested and changed in response to political events. And like in Georgian case, since like October, every single day, so many things are happening. It just, I don't know, I can't digest really that these emotions are very changing all the time. So it's very much kind of, it all develops and elevates in response to this external stimuli, which is always there, always. And it's very interesting to see these pathways and to see it's in a broader, this infrastructure, what I call it. So, and if you imagine the networks, like what like pops out in response to which stimuli. So I too like have this kind of depiction. It will be very interesting. So this is what I'm thinking about now, how to like, how to process that in that way. Yes, and about these questions, like if I understood correctly, you meant about how solidarities like evolve, how solidarities are kind of received by those to whom they are targeted, right? So this is what you meant. Well, I think that here is as well kind of, at least from my perspective, it's a kind of what Pierre also mentioned about this ambivalence of solidarity. It's a kind of identity work, how I can see it. And in any case, like whenever solidarity movements, and it depends which groups are mobilized, right? It's important that this group identity should be resonated with the target like group. So because usually for those people who are like, who need this solidarity, if they don't like people who are mobilizing for them, then it kind of has backlash. And I can see that this, for example, in Georgia, like we had like actions and contractions like in the past, and there was always backlash in that sense. And the second question was about cooptation, right? And in this sense, well, I agree actually what you said, and I think that there are a lot of kind of cases when it's also kind of field of contestation, right? So when somebody is doing something and you are kind of taking their strategies, their tactics, and like owning, and by this kind of dismantling the original kind of mobilization or initiative. And I think it's a huge problem, and this is very important that in that very moment, this you should have these resources and strategies to kind of respond in a proper way. But it's a kind of, back and forth moving and responding. So it's a huge contest, and it's hard to say, like, I mean, what are the factors that are determining like the wins on one or another group. Yeah, I hope I responded all your questions.
Thank you, Nino. Elena, do you want to add anything? No, I guess she doesn't. Tiago, you were mentioning maybe you have another question?
Yeah, it's sort of a question to the three of you. Because one of the things that we discussed when we started writing the call for papers, and it was pretty much on the table, was, you know, a sense that there were a lot of mobilizations, local mobilizations, but they had sort of a transnational feel, that there were solidarities forming across borders. So in all of your cases, that seems to be interesting, or happening from Georgia to Ukraine, between students and the refugee and movement. So I wanted you to explore a bit this dimension and how that happens. Yeah, and another thing that I was interested in hearing is, you know, if you go through a more culturalist kind of perspective, it's, you know, normally there are symbols and that unite all of these more transnational and even national groups. So I was thinking if you could talk a bit about that, and if you find that in your cases as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. Maybe I was a little bit rushing. Elena also is asking if Didem and Pierre want to add something about the reception of solidarity and possible cooptation. So you can decide, each of you, to respond.
I can jump
order
in
you
if you
prefer.
like.
Okay, please. Thank you.
I actually want to kind of tie what Elena and Tiago talked about, because I think they are relevant in terms of trying to understand like the complexity of what we call solidarity, right? So let me like narrow down my cases to anti-apartheid student organization, student mobilization, and anti-tuition fee hike student mobilization, 2 cases. Both of them had international scale. The former was truly transnational, the latter was more targeting national policies. So in the first case, if we think about how these solidarities work in terms of the dynamics or in terms of creating a certain kind of cultural understanding, I think we need to look at it from the perspective of, is it some sort of an interaction between equals, or is it an interaction between someone who is capable of handing a helping hand to the, you know, risking the danger of going into Pierre's territory? Is it like a charity in terms of an relationship in which someone who is in a more powerful situation is helping the weaker partner or not? Or is it like a more alliance of equals? In the case of anti-apartheid mobilization against the Proteria regime in the case of South Africa, this was, from my perspective, an organization of alliances, a transnational one, because the leaders of the mobilization asked for international reactions to put pressure on the South African government. They went to the student mobilization groups like South African exiles, leaders of ANC, for example, visited different campuses across the globe to thank and encourage mobilization of the students against, to impose sanctions basically on South Africa. So it was more of a, it wasn't like a relationship between unequals, but it was more like a partnership. It wasn't reciprocal. So it was like, it was a one direction in that kind of mobilization. But when we come back to the case of the anti-tuition student mobilization, there were 2 levels of solidarity. One would be between students coming from different class backgrounds. So students from middle classes could easily pay 500 euros, no problem, usually. But it became a part of affront to the identity of studentship. So the type of solidarity that built the movement between students from middle class background, students from working class background, irrespective of their political position, was very much related to this kind of shared identity of experience and also equality, that we are the same, we have this thing in common, right? But the additional component of that mobilization is the alliance between student mobilization and the labor. So taking 2 cases, one successful, one not so successful, United States and Turkey, around the same time, in both countries, there was tuition hikes. Of course, it was much, much bigger in the case of the United States because of the tuition fee amounts. But in the case of Turkey, there was a kind of an alliance between the labor movement. At least some of the labor unions were part of an alliance to support students' mobilization against tuition hikes. 1 year after that kind of alliance to stop tuitions, there was a big mining accident in Turkey. And in response, all those leading campuses of anti-tuition mobilization responded en masse to protests, working conditions in mines in support of these labor unions. Of course, not all students participated, but there was a kind of a close-knit alliance between student activists of left-wing, let's say, ideological position and the labor unions that they worked with a couple of years before in relation to tuition. So there was a kind of organic alliance that led to being a partnership of equals rather than having an inequality or cooptation. But in the case of the United States, there was a big divide that made the movement fracture. And that divide came from the class perception. A lot of the perception of the tuition issue came down to perceived class position and also racial issues. Some of the unions did not really fully engage in the alliance to support students who were trying to organize against tuition hikes in the case of the United States, because they thought that students who go to, these universities that require thousands of dollars in tuition are either coming from middle class or a minority of working class students who get grants. So this is not a primary issue for us as working class unions. A second issue was that most of the student organizers were white in the anti-tuition mobilization, and some of the unions were trying to make sure that Black and brown service workers were trying to unionize. So there came a kind of a race divide that prevented this kind of identity formation or alliance formation that kind of leads to a fracture. So going back to Elena's point in that sense, sometimes these issues of unequal power relations issue or question mark of reciprocity basically decides the fate of how successful these solidarity movements will be, either in the past as people learn from the past and share a collective identity of alliance building, or in the present when they try and it fails and then they don't try again, if it kind of makes any sense. So that's going to be related to Tiago's point as well at some point, I hope. Does it make sense? I hope so.
Thank you, Didem. Pierre, you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks. I can try to respond to address some of the points here. And the first one is, Elena, thanks. That's a really important question. How is solidarity received by the subjects of solidarity? I think that's still a blind spot of a lot of research on these on these type of movements. People like Clément Lucioni in France has worked on how migrants who are hosted by refugee support volunteers negotiate the relation and the hosting practice. And so people like Kaylee Garthwaite have worked on how poor people in food banks, and so their relation with volunteers. But still, there isn't enough research on this topic in particular. What I saw in my own research, but really indirectly, is that. I mean, I guess this is going to be a very obvious point, but that those who received solidarity are not just passive agents. They are able to address the ambivalences I was talking about earlier, and a lot of the shifts I mentioned earlier into maybe more emancipatory practices come in fact they come in fact from those who receive solidarity when they question the solidarity the practices of those who are established as solidarity actors. So I don't know if that answers your question, but really, yeah, it's to say it's a blind spot of a lot of research on these questions, I think, at least from my perspective. Cooptation, yeah, I mean, we see that a lot. I mean, I'm thinking in particular about refugee support movements. We see that a lot when organizations become service providers on behalf of the state. And here really the fact that solidarity practices are about, in many cases, providing direct daily support in the form of charity action, sometimes humanitarian action, leads sometimes to a reliance on state funding, and this can be a form of cooptation, a form of control on the part of the state. We've seen that recently in the UK, but also in other countries with the organizations who welcomed refugees from Ukraine in particular. Yeah, international solidarity, that's a really good point, Tiago. I think, I mean, obvious point that emerged from that I observed in my research is that international solidarity means the circulation of practices, some innovations circulate across countries, and so this is something I've seen, but also I think that there is something about and that relates to the idea of solidarity as a moral project, I guess I was mentioning earlier, at a very individual level, but also collective level, positioning yourself as international solidarity actor gives a sense of an identity, a progressive identity, gives a sense of something that goes against, from again, this idea of a moral project perspective, goes against nationalistic projects, and so I think we see it recently in the case of Gaza. It's a positioning exercise also to become an international solidarity actor. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your questions. Just yeah, a reflection really.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. I don't know if anybody else wants to add any question or comment to the actual discussion. Well, I just have a little comment. I was thinking, because of what I'm researching on, that is mostly housing movements, and yeah, since a while here in Barcelona, it happens often in assembly discussion, this topic of a bit of moral versus political goals, in a way, in the sense that, for example, the push for helping a person in risk of eviction is mostly moral reaction, let's say. Also empathizing with the person that is living a moment of crisis. That's something that's perceivable in the assembly, where normally these kind of problems emerge, and the resistance is organized. But then when this person after doesn't keep participating to the political struggle, then this person is transformed from the person that deserve the help to the person that is undeserving the help, because what is confused is moral help from political struggle. So I guess that it's not necessary that one thing produce or politicization or depoliticization of the struggle or of the solidarity among people or among groups. I think it's as you say, it's a shifting boundary, and it's quite it's probably changing from groups to from struggles to struggles. But I think it's a quite interesting topic to investigate more, for sure. And it's probably involving how the subject receives the solidarity. So how clear for the subject that is receiving the solidarity is the goal of this solidarity, what is behind, and how much this person consider her or himself involved into the struggle itself. Although I have to say that these groups really struggle for not having a top-down process, not being the activist helping the poor, but trying to involve a lot the person that is living a crisis into the struggle itself. Although I guess it's a political issue nowadays for many people to understand where solidarity finish and a political struggle starts and what solidarity means in this sense. I don't know if Pierre, you want to add something about it, or it was more a comment than a question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's that's a really good point, which relates to this notion of deservingness also. I mean, this is something that I observed in my own research. The deserving recipient of support is also someone who gives back. So in many ways, in many cases, we observe that deservingness also implies an idea of reciprocity. You need to give back, be part of the movement, or give back in a sort of showing gratitude for example, sometimes. And so that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. The last thing is that if all the presenters, do you have any questions to for each others? I don't know about the others' presentation. Didem, Pierre, and Nino, do you want to ask each other something? Since it's a roundtable, maybe there is still some topic that haven't been addressed.
I actually have a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
For Nino, I was wondering, really interesting about the emotions, and so I was wondering about how emotions shift over time. Whether you see that some emotions which were prevalent maybe in the beginning of the movement are becoming less prevalent. And I was wondering about one emotion in particular, which has been observed by people like Olivier Filleul, and so activists fatigue and burnout, and so if this is something that you observed in your research.
Thank you. Yes, so as I said, it's quite. I mean, for us, it's quite a long time that this protest lasted. So it started in November, and till now, every evening, there are protests in the Central Avenue. And yes, there is a fatigue. I mean, you can feel, and if you compare what was happening in December, for example, size of protests are really decreasing. It's kind of this feeling that something new should happen, some new stimulus should come into play, just to make those people who are in despair and where solidarity feelings doesn't help, they should kind of they should be motivated. So the dynamics is, unfortunately, at the moment, I can say that in terms of size, you can see this decreasing size of protests, and there is this fatigue and more despair than this solidarity. But there are kind of in this protest, there are people who are always there. So there's kind of constant kind of figures in this protest, activists and just participants of the protests who don't call themselves as activists. And even though when I was talking about despair, they are also in that sense in despair, in a sense that they don't have this belief that they can change something. But still, this is a huge drive for them in terms of motivation, that they are there for others and not particularly for to make change. So it's very unpredictable what will happen. And as I said, every time there's something new happening. So and I think December was kind of very interesting month in that sense to observe, because really every hour something new was happening. Someone there was some new speech from one of the politicians that that made everyone angry and enraged, and then someone said something else, and so it's a huge big story. So I don't know, we'll see what will happen in the future. I hope for the best. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if Didem or Pierre or Nino have any other question. Otherwise, I have a question from Catalina Fabian. Okay, I will go on. So here she says, how do you, if you do, separate counter movements solidarity as reaction to movements, transnational, pro-life, anti-gender, for example? Is anybody willing to reply to this question?
Sorry, Catalina,
Yeah.
would it be okay to clarify the question?
Catalina? Catalina Fabian? She's hearing us. Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Hello.
Well, I thought this is relatively straightforward. This has been a huge, both methodological question. If we separate whatever we define the original movement, in this case, let's say democracy, pro-LGBT, human rights, gender, call whatever you want, environmental issues, students' movements for various kinds, and the reaction to that. Many times the reaction takes the very same theater, the type of tools to mobilize, i.e. use frames or interests to create solidarity. So my question to you, if you separate these two, or you say, well, movement, and how, in this case, can you see any difference in the types of solidarity they employ? Is this any clearer now?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I can answer. So my research, my previous research was about actions and contractions all on LGBTQ rights mobilizations. So there were mobilizations of LGBTQ people and their supporters, and then there were reaction to these reactive mobilizations from radical groups in Georgia. And when I was researching it, it's for sure I was distinguishing analytically those two groups, because they are kind of protests. They weren't movements, but they were protests, but they were kind of protests and counter protests. And if we think about how their strategies, tactics, or kind of cultural work works overall, it's very much dependent on each other. So if we can say that there is one kind of protests, those protests will have completely different life if they will be just protest and there will be nothing else, on the horizon, in a sense of counter protests. So as soon as counter protests emerge, those protests change a lot. It's, at least in Georgian case, I can talk a lot about this. And again, it's a counter protests create environment where this identity work comes into place, and there's a lot of reshaping of tactics, of thinking where you are and how you should respond and where are the boundaries. And so there's a whole new processes come along. So I think that counter mobilizations in general, there's not much attention paid to this kind of mobilization. So I think it's worth really considering more. It's very interesting to observe the interaction of these two. I use this word action and counteraction because in Georgia we named it like this. So maybe it was not clear previously that I mentioned it like this. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, thank you, Nina. First, Catalina, do you want to add something?
This is what I've been looking for, but many of you have very critical angles, and I would like to further push this argument, what I heard, which is exactly on the point, that some of the perspectives, especially the counter movements, tend to have a much more privileged access to resources, i.e. to create the solidarity movement, through churches or other types of tools. So I really wonder if others have seen this asymmetry of I'm not sure we could call it solidarity on both sides. So that's what I'm poking at, and I hope people can resonate with that. I really appreciate all the responses you would have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond to Katalin. So yeah, that's so true. That this the power is so asymmetrical in that sense, because at least in my case, in my research case, so counter protests were always organized, like at least implicitly organized by government. So this power, like asymmetrics of the power, is so vivid and clear. And usually in many cases they won in some sense, like culturally, for example, or a kind of they dispersed the original protests. And so yeah, that's always problematic. And I could say that this is mostly the case, that power is on the side of counter mobilizations.
Thank you. Didem, you wanted to add something about it?
Yeah, I just want to mention like 2 points. One is not all of the solidarity movements have counter movements, right? Like in the case of the student movements that I mentioned, like 2 of them, we didn't see a significant counter movement. I mean, of course, there was counter forces against those kind of solidarity, perhaps based movements, but they were either on the part of the government or coming from like strong businesses, so you wouldn't consider them as counter protests. But if you think, I would essentially agree with Katalin in terms of looking at movement interactions in a more like a long durée type of way, into especially like thinking about pro-life movements. Like this was the kind of the organizing kind of force behind the pro-life movements were the church, right? So they were there before the actual movement was there. So there was a really, was it a counter movement at specific points in time? Yes, but like largely speaking, maybe not so much. So we have to maybe analyze it with a different kind of framework, because they don't necessarily have to conduct the same solidarity work as the other movements. So in that regard, I agree with Katalin, but at the same time, I was thinking about the anti-gender movement. Patriarchy has been there, right? So like the feminist movement has been fighting it for like 2 centuries. But at the same time, what we see right now in the past decade is something else. And then perhaps we can talk about the counter movements, but their position, their starting position is such a resonant political and cultural point that they wouldn't necessarily need the same type of solidarity work either. They could try to talk about grievances. They could talk about shared identities in terms of certain type of man and not getting like meritocratic treatment, whatever. But I think that's a different animal in terms of analyzing stuff. But these are, of course, not the movements that I'm studying, so I'm just speculating, thinking out loud in response to your responses.
Yeah, just on this point quickly, and I'm thinking again about the case of the pro-refugee movements that I observed. Yeah, there are counter movements, and the far right is a counter movement, and we have in Western European countries specific groups that have been organized specifically to target migrants and border crossing, and so they can be defined as counter movements. I mean, something for me that was interesting to observe is that the existence of generally of the far right and also of these more specific counter movements was, for many of the people we interviewed, was something that pushed them towards politicization. because of the existence of these counter movements, they constructed their engagement not just as a way of providing direct support to refugees, but also more generally as a form of resistance, as some of them call the resistance, but or as a form of alternative discourse to the far right, but also to dominant anti-immigration policies and discourses in the public space. So yeah, the counter movements can push participants towards more politicized forms of engagement, and this is something that I observed in my research. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I don't know if anybody else has a question or comment to add to this discussion. Please do it now. Otherwise, I think that we can wrap up this webinar session that was very interesting and a great introduction to the conference that will be held this summer in Vienna in June. As we say, in participation between ESA, ACPR, and CES. So thank you, Pierre, Didem, and Nino, to participate today to this debate, and thank you for your presentation and the interesting points you raised. Thank you to all the participants for coming today, and thank you to Tiago for organizing with me, and Guia for hosting this webinar today. And I don't know if Tiago wants to add something.
No, just think everyone was present and took an interest on our seminar today, and thank also to Didem, Pierre, and Nino for their wonderful contributions to our discussion. And I hope to see you in Vienna as well.
Marco,
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiago, Luisa. Thank you all. Thank you.
I'm seeing Marco there. Did you want to add something, Marco? No, it's okay. Okay, thank you to everybody. Then we close the session here. And yeah, we hope to see you in Vienna. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.